On May 19, 1536, a woman knelt on a wooden scaffold at Tower Green. She'd rehearsed this moment the night before, practicing how to position her neck on the block. But there was no block. Her husband, Henry VIII, had paid the equivalent of $50,000 for a French swordsman to take her head with a single stroke. She would kneel upright, staring straight ahead into nothing. 3 years and 4 months. That's how long Anne Boleyn lasted as Queen of England. And this is what makes Henry VIII's marriages so fascinating. They weren't just royal affairs gone wrong. They were a series of escalating disasters that fundamentally transformed an entire nation. 6 women married the same man over 38 years. And only one walked away with her head still attached to her body. Divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. You've probably heard that rhyme. But the rhyme doesn't tell you about the screaming during childbirth that lasted 3 days. It doesn't tell you about the letters written at midnight, begging for mercy that would never come. It doesn't tell you about the woman who sat on the king's lap while his current wife watched in horror. Over the next 30 minutes, I'm going to walk you through the fate of each of these 6 women, not as statistics or historical footnotes, but as actual human beings. They were all caught in the orbit of a man who transformed from a charming, athletic young king into a paranoid tyrant consumed by his own rotting leg and his desperate obsession for a male heir. And by the end, you'll understand something crucial. The man these women married at the beginning was not the same man who signed their death warrants or cast them aside. Something changed in Henry VIII. What that change was and when exactly it happened might just explain everything. Let's start with the woman who lasted the longest, Katherine of Aragon. 24 years as Queen of England, nearly a quarter-century bound to Henry VIII. She arrived in England in 1501, a Spanish princess with royal blood flowing through her veins from both sides. Her parents were Ferdinand and Isabella, the very monarchs who funded Christopher Columbus and transformed Spain into the most powerful kingdom in Europe. Katherine even descended from English royalty through John of Gaunt's line. In terms of pure pedigree, she was arguably more royal than Henry himself. But Katherine came to England to marry the wrong prince. Her original intended was Arthur, Henry's older brother, the heir to the throne. They married in May 1501 at St. Paul's Cathedral in London. Katherine was 15. Arthur was also 15. The wedding was lavish. The alliance between England and Spain was sealed. Then Arthur and Katherine were sent to Ludlow Castle. Within 5 months, Arthur was dead. The sweating sickness, a mysterious disease that could kill within hours, claimed him in April 1502. Katherine was now 16. A widow in a foreign country, speaking limited English, her future hanging in the balance. Instead of sending her and her massive dowry back to Spain, King Henry VII kept her in England. For 7 years, she existed in a kind of limbo. Not quite a princess, not quite a nobody. Her fate depended entirely on diplomatic negotiations between 2 kingdoms arguing over money. Eventually, a solution emerged. Katherine would marry the new heir to the throne, Prince Henry, Arthur's younger brother. But this created a major theological problem. The Bible, in Leviticus, forbade a man from marrying his brother's widow, warning that such a union would be childless. To proceed, the Pope had to grant a special dispensation, essentially declaring the biblical rule didn't apply because Katherine and Arthur's marriage had never been consummated. Katherine swore she was still a virgin when Arthur died. The Church accepted her testimony, and the dispensation was granted. When Henry VIII ascended the throne in 1509 at just 17 years old, one of his first acts as king was to marry Katherine. And here's what history often glosses over. He chose to marry her. There was no obligation. He could have sent her back to Spain or pursued other alliances. Instead, he married her quickly, publicly, and with obvious enthusiasm. Their early years were genuinely happy. Katherine was intelligent, politically astute, and devoted to her new husband. Henry trusted her implicitly. In 1513, when the Scottish king invaded England while Henry was off fighting in France, Henry left Katherine as regent, putting her in charge of defending the entire kingdom. And she didn't disappoint. Katherine oversaw the English defense personally, leaving London with over 1,500 sets of armor for her troops. When the English won at Flodden Field and the Scottish king lay dead on the battlefield, Katherine sent Henry the blood-soaked cloak of James IV. She reportedly considered sending the body itself but thought better of it. Thomas Cromwell, who would later become her enemy, sighed of Katherine, if not for her sex, she could have defied all the heroes of history. But Katherine had one job that superseded all others. She had to produce a male heir, and her body kept betraying her. The pregnancies came in rapid succession: miscarriages, stillbirths, infants who gasped for breath and died within days. In 1511 she gave birth to a son, Prince Henry. The entire kingdom rejoiced. Bonfires were lit across London. Finally, an heir. The baby died 52 days later. More pregnancies followed, and more tragedies. The only child who survived infancy was a daughter, Mary, born in 1516. A healthy girl, but not a boy. Never a boy. By the early 1520s, Katherine was in her late 30s, her childbearing years clearly ending. And Henry began to convince himself that God was punishing him. That Levitical verse, the one about marrying your brother's widow resulting in childlessness, started to haunt him. What if the Pope's dispensation had been wrong? What if his marriage had been invalid from the start? What if all those dead babies were divine retribution for an unholy union? Meanwhile, a new woman had appeared at court. A lady-in-waiting in Katherine's own household. Dark-haired, witty, sophisticated, and most importantly, fertile. Her name was Anne Boleyn, and her arrival would set in motion a chain of events that would not only destroy a queen, but tear a kingdom apart. Imagine being queen for nearly 20 years. You've defended the kingdom, buried child after child, and remained a faithful, devoted wife. Now your husband declares your entire marriage was a mistake, a theological error. This was Katherine of Aragon's reality. Her husband, King Henry VIII, had fallen for another woman, one who was young enough to bear the son he so desperately craved, Anne Boleyn. When Henry requested an annulment, Katherine refused. She would spend the rest of her life insisting she was Henry's true and valid wife. The Pope, caught between Henry's demands and pressure from Katherine's powerful nephew, the Holy Roman Emperor, refused to grant the annulment. This refusal changed history forever. Unable to get what he wanted from Rome, Henry did something unprecedented. He broke with the Catholic Church entirely. The Church of England was established, with Henry as its supreme head. An entire nation changed its religion. Also a king could end his marriage. On May 23, 1533, after 24 years as queen, Katherine's marriage was annulled. She was stripped of her title, demoted and cruelly, separated from her daughter Mary. They would never see each other again. Katherine died on January 7, 1536, at the age of 50. Her final letter to Henry was signed, Katherine the Queen. To the very end she maintained her claim. Here's the bitter irony. Katherine died just 3 months before Anne Boleyn herself was executed. Had she lived just a little longer, she would have witnessed the downfall of the woman who replaced her. Now who was this woman who toppled a queen and changed a nation? Anne Boleyn was no passive victim. Born to an ambitious courtier family, she was sent to the sophisticated French court as a teenager. When she returned to England in 1522, she joined Queen Catherine's household as a lady-in-waiting. She wasn't a classic beauty, but she was striking, with dark eyes, a graceful neck, and an energy that made her the center of attention. She was an excellent dancer, a skilled musician, and dangerously witty. By 1526, King Henry was completely infatuated. And here's where Anne made her revolutionary move. She refused to become his mistress. Her own sister Mary had already been the king's lover and was quietly set aside. Anne demanded more. She would accept nothing less than a crown. The audacity of this is hard to overstate. No one refused the king. No commoner demanded marriage. But Anne understood the game. She knew Henry's desperation for a male heir, and she knew she had what he wanted badly enough to tear his kingdom apart for it. And she was right. To marry Anne, Henry broke with Rome, executed his closest friends who opposed him, and seized the wealth of every monastery in England. He transformed the entire religious and political landscape of his nation. All for the woman who wouldn't sleep with him until he gave her a crown. They married secretly in January 1533, while Anne was already pregnant. On June 1st, she was crowned queen. But the public was cold. They loved Katherine and saw Anne as a scheming usurper. Then, on September 7th, Anne gave birth to a daughter, Elizabeth. 2.5 years later, on January 24, 1536, a catastrophic event occurred that would seal Anne's fate and forever change Henry VIII. While jousting, the king's fully armored horse fell on top of him. Henry lay unconscious for 2 hours. When he awoke, he was a changed man. Historians speculate this led to a traumatic brain injury, affecting his impulse control and fueling his increasingly erratic and violent behavior. Before the accident, Henry had executed 0 wives. After, he would execute 2. Before, he was a king who could be reasoned with. After, he became a monster. Just 5 days after Henry's jousting accident, Anne Boleyn miscarried. The baby was a boy. The timing was disastrous. Henry's roving eye had already landed on Jane Seymour, one of Anne's own ladies-in-waiting, young, quiet, and submissive. With the loss of the male heir, Anne's fate was sealed. Thomas Cromwell, once her ally, now orchestrated her downfall. An investigation was launched, and shocking charges were fabricated. On May 2, 1536, Queen Anne was arrested. The charges were staggering: adultery with 5 men, including her own brother, incest, and plotting to murder the king. The trial was a complete farce. No credible witnesses were ever produced to support the charges. The jury was stacked with men who stood to gain from her family's destruction. Only one of the accused men, a court musician named Mark Smeaton, confessed, likely under torture. It was enough. On May 15, Anne was found guilty of treason and sentenced to death. Her brother George and the 4 other men were also executed. But then, Henry did something strange. He, the man who had just condemned his wife as a traitor and adulteress, made a specific request for her execution. He demanded she be beheaded not with the common axe, but with a sword. A sword was faster, more merciful. He even ordered an expert swordsman to be brought over from France. It was a bizarre, final act of either lingering affection or calculated control. On the morning of May 19, 1536, Anne Boleyn walked to the scaffold. Dressed in a dark gray gown, she addressed the small crowd, not with anger, but with dignity. She asked them to pray for the king, calling him a good and gentle lord. With her final words, she commended her soul to God. The French swordsman did his work with a single, swift stroke. Anne was dead. She was not yet 35 years old. The queen who had changed the course of English history had reigned for just over 1,000 days. The very next day, Henry VIII became engaged to Jane Seymour. They were married just 10 days later. Jane would finally give Henry the son he craved, Edward, but she would die from complications of childbirth shortly after. She was the only one of Henry's 6 wives to receive a queen's funeral. The stories of Katherine of Aragon and Anne Boleyn are a powerful reminder of the brutal realities of power, ambition, and gender in the Tudor court. 2 remarkable women, locked in a struggle for a crown, a king, and their very survival. Their legacies continue to fascinate us centuries later, a dramatic tale of love, betrayal, and revolution. On May 19, 1536, Anne Boleyn walked to the scaffold. In a brief, standard speech, she admitted her sins to God and King. Condemned prisoners were expected to accept their fate. After being blindfolded, a French swordsman, specially brought from Calais, quietly removed his shoes so she wouldn't hear him approach. With a single swift swing, it was over. She was probably not yet 30 and had been queen for just over 3 years. Her body was placed in an old arrow chest. No coffin was provided and buried in a chapel within the Tower of London. She left behind a daughter, Elizabeth, who would become one of England's greatest monarchs. The very next day, Henry VIII was formally betrothed to Jane Seymour. The people murmured. The imperial ambassador wrote that several affirmed that long before the death of the other, there was some arrangement which sounds ill in the ears of the people. Jane married Henry on May 30th, just 11 days after Anne's execution. The blood was barely dry. Jane was everything Anne was not. Where Anne was witty and bold, Jane was quiet and demure. Where Anne challenged and provoked, Jane submitted and soothed. Contemporary accounts describe her as fair but pale and not a great beauty, but Jane was not as passive as she seemed. When Henry sent her a love letter with a purse of gold, she refused them dramatically, declaring her honor was her greatest riches. This performance of virtue delighted Henry. Here was a woman who knew her place. And yet, consider the timing. Jane had been in Anne's household. She had watched the Queen's isolation grow, had seen Henry's attention wander, and had positioned herself perfectly to catch his eye just as Anne was becoming expendable. In January 1536, Anne caught Jane sitting on Henry's lap. The 2 women reportedly had a physical fight over it, and Anne later blamed the incident for her miscarriage. 3 months later, Anne was dead and Jane was queen. Jane's reign was brief but consequential. She was never crowned. The coronation kept being postponed. Some historians think Henry wanted to wait until she produced an heir. In May 1537, Jane's pregnancy was announced. London celebrated with bonfires and masses. Henry, showing genuine concern, moved Jane to the safety of Hampton Court to avoid a plague sweeping through the city. On September 16, Jane entered confinement, the traditional withdrawal from public life for expectant mothers. Her chambers were sealed, the windows covered. Labor began on October 9. It lasted for 3 agonizing days. For 3 days, London prayed while Henry paced, waiting for news of a male heir. At 2 a.m. on October 12, 1537, Jane Seymour gave birth to a son, Edward. This was the heir Henry had spent nearly 30 years pursuing, the heir for whom he had broken with Rome, executed one wife, and cast aside another. Jane seemed to recover well. She was sitting up in bed and receiving guests by October 15th, but the next day, she fell violently ill. The diagnosis at the time was vague, but in reality, she almost certainly contracted puerperal fever, a common and deadly infection after childbirth. Her doctors had no understanding of germ theory. Rumors later circulated that Henry had ordered a C-section, choosing to save the child over the mother. This is false. No woman could have survived such a procedure in the 16th century. Jane Seymour died at 2 a.m. on October 24, 1537. She was about 28 years old and had been queen for less than 18 months. Henry was devastated, or at least he appeared to be. He wore black for 3 months and spoke of Jane with affection for the rest of his life. When he died 10 years later, his will specified he be buried next to her. She was the only wife who gave him a surviving son. Perhaps for Henry that was enough. Henry waited nearly 2.5 years before marrying again, and this time it wasn't for love. By 1539, England faced a terrifying threat. The 2 major Catholic powers, France and the Holy Roman Empire, were discussing an alliance. A religious crusade against Protestant England seemed possible. Henry needed allies, and fast. His chief minister, Thomas Cromwell, proposed a solution: a marriage to Anne of Cleves. Her brother was an influential Protestant leader in Northern Europe. An alliance could counter the Catholic threat. Anne was 24, unmarried, and reportedly attractive. Henry commissioned the famous artist Hans Holbein to paint her portrait. The painting showed a pleasant-looking woman. Henry agreed to the match. Anne arrived in England on New Year's Day, 1540. Henry, ever the romantic, decided to surprise her by visiting unannounced and in disguise. According to courtly tradition, the woman was supposed to instantly recognize her beloved. Anne didn't. She showed little interest in the strange man who had barged into her chambers. Henry, whose ego was massive, felt humiliated. From that moment, the marriage was doomed. They wed on January 6, 1540. The wedding night was a disaster. Henry later complained he had no physical attraction to his new wife, calling her the Flanders Mare. But the problems were deeper than just appearance. Anne spoke almost no English, and knew no French or Latin, the languages of Henry's court. She wasn't trained in music or dance. The cultural gap was simply too wide. Meanwhile, the Catholic alliance that had prompted the marriage never happened. The political reason for the union had evaporated. And Henry had already noticed another woman in Anne of Cleves' household. A young, vivacious, and flirtatious lady-in-waiting named Katherine Howard. Cromwell, who had arranged the marriage, was now in an impossible position. His diplomatic masterpiece had become a political liability. On June 10, 1540, he was arrested for treason. 1 month later, on July 9, Henry's marriage to Anne of Cleves was annulled on the grounds of non-consummation. Anne, showing remarkable political savvy, accepted the annulment without a fight. She had seen what happened to Katherine of Aragon, who refused and died in poverty and exile. Anne chose a different path. Henry VIII's 4th wife, Anne of Cleves, faced a terrifying reality. His first wife, Katherine of Aragon, was cast aside. Anne Boleyn was executed. Jane Seymour died in childbirth. Every one of Henry's previous wives had met a terrible end. So Anne of Cleves chose survival. And Henry, surprisingly, rewarded her choice. He gave her a huge annual income, multiple palaces, and the honorary title of the king's beloved sister. Essentially, she was paid handsomely to go away quietly. On the very same day, Henry's chief minister Cromwell was beheaded, July 28, 1540. The king married his 5th wife, Katherine Howard. Anne of Cleves went on to live for another 17 years. She outlived Henry and all his other wives, dying in 1557 at age 41. She had successfully navigated the most dangerous court in Europe by knowing exactly when to step aside. Catherine Howard was a completely different story. She was probably only around 16 when she caught the eye of the 49-year-old king. Henry was in constant pain from a leg ulcer, growing more paranoid by the day, and desperate to recapture his youth. Catherine represented everything he had lost. She came from the same powerful Howard family as Anne Boleyn. They were cousins. But where Anne had been sophisticated and strategic, Catherine was young and impulsive. She'd been raised with very little supervision in the chaotic household of her step-grandmother. As a young teenager, she had a romance with her music teacher and later, a more serious relationship with a man named Francis Derham, who called himself her husband. These kinds of things weren't unheard of in large, poorly supervised noble households, but for Catherine, they would prove fatal. Henry married her on July 28, 1540, calling her his rose without a thorn. He showered her with gifts and jewels, and for a while, he seemed rejuvenated. He was hunting and dancing with an energy he hadn't shown in years, but Henry didn't know the full story. His young Rose wasn't a virgin, and she hadn't left her past completely behind her. In November 1541, just over a year into the marriage, rumors reached the court that Catherine was having a secret affair with a young courtier named Thomas Culpeper. When Henry was confronted with the evidence, he reportedly broke down in tears. Then his grief turned to rage. He allegedly called for a sword, vowing to execute his adulterous wife himself. Catherine was stripped of her title as queen. Francis Derham and Thomas Culpeper were convicted of treason and executed that December. Instead of giving Catherine a public trial where she might defend herself, Henry condemned her through an act of attainder, a parliamentary decree of guilt that required no trial at all. The act also made it treason for any future queen to fail to disclose an unchaste past. This essentially criminalized Catherine's premarital life after the fact. On February 10, 1542, Catherine was taken to the Tower of London. As her boat passed under London Bridge, she would have seen the heads of Derham and Culpeper displayed on spikes, a gruesome preview of her own fate. A chilling detail survives from her final night. Catherine reportedly asked for the executioner, Zes Block, to be brought to her room so she could practice laying her head upon it. She wanted to die with dignity. On the morning of February 13, 1542, Catherine was escorted to Tower Green, the very same spot where her cousin Anne Boleyn had been beheaded. She gave a short speech, admitting her sins, and knelt at the block. She was probably only 18 or 19 years old. Henry VIII's final wife, Katherine Parr, was different from all the others. She wasn't a teenager. She was 31 when she married Henry in 1543, and she wasn't inexperienced. She'd already been married and widowed twice. Crucially, she was in love with someone else. Before Henry proposed, Catherine was planning to marry Thomas Seymour, the brother of the late Jane Seymour. It was a genuine love match, but refusing a king simply wasn't an option. So Catherine set aside her personal feelings, convincing herself it was God's will for her to marry Henry. They wed on July 12, 1543. Catherine was well-educated, articulate, and politically savvy. She became the first English queen to publish a book in her own name, a work of theology expressing her strong Protestant beliefs. But those very beliefs nearly got her killed. In 1546, a suspicious Henry began to crack down on religious reformers at court. A warrant for Catherine's arrest may have even been drawn up. She was walking a tightrope, one misstep away from becoming the third of Henry's queens to be beheaded. Catherine survived through a clever combination of flattery and submission. She convinced Henry she was only debating with him to learn from his superior wisdom as the supreme head of the church. She stroked his ego, deferred to his authority, and backed away from her dangerous religious positions. It worked. Catherine also achieved something none of Henry's previous wives could. She reunited the fractured royal family. She built genuine, loving relationships with all three of Henry's children, Mary, Elizabeth, and Edward. She helped reconcile the king with his two daughters, who had been cast aside for years. This act of kindness would have profound consequences for England. After Henry's death, all three of his children, from three different mothers, would eventually rule as monarchs. Catherine helped ensure they were seen as legitimate heirs. Henry VIII died on January 28, 1547. Katherine, at 34, was the only wife to outlive him. Within months, she married Thomas Seymour, the man she had loved all along. But her happiness was short-lived. She became pregnant, and on September 5, 1548, she died from a fever after childbirth, the same complication that had killed Jane Seymour. She was 35. 6 marriages, spanning over 2 decades. Looking at them all together, a dark pattern emerges, one of escalating instability and cruelty. The Henry who married Katherine of Aragon in 1509 was not the same man who signed Catherine Howard's death warrant in 1542. Something changed him. Perhaps it was a gradual decline, or perhaps it was accelerated by that jousting accident in 1536. Before that year, Henry had executed political enemies, but never a wife. After he would behead 2. The women in his life were trapped in a system where their entire value was tied to producing a male heir. Catherine of Aragon buried baby after baby trying to meet this impossible demand. Anne Boleyn was destroyed when she failed to deliver a son. Jane Seymour died succeeding where they had failed. And Catherine Howard was executed for daring to have a life before she became royal property. Only 2 escaped with their lives: Anne of Cleves, who cleverly negotiated her own exit, and Catherine Parr, who outlived him through intelligence and luck. Each of these 6 women made choices within the severe limits placed upon them. They weren't just victims. They were intelligent, capable people navigating impossible circumstances. Some played the game brilliantly and still lost. One played it perfectly and survived. And all of them were bound to a man whose transformation from a charming young king to a paranoid, violent tyrant shaped the fate of an entire nation. If you want to understand what Henry VIII himself went through in his final years, the pain, the paranoia, and the horrific end that awaited him, I've covered that in another video. Thanks for watching.